With so many opening books, magazine articles and computer databases, preparing your opening repertoire can be like a full-time job. But if you're like me and you actually prefer playing chess to studying it, then you should consider the system I'm going to recommend today. The great beauty of this opening is that you can learn it very quickly. And what's more, the chances are your opponent will never have seen it before. I've been playing this opening for nearly 10 years, but I'm still able to surprise world-class grandmasters with it because it's such an obscure line. The opening begins, e4, normal move by white, and black plays 1 g6. White completes the occupation of the centre with d4, and in turn black completes the fianchetto with bishop g7. Now the most normal way for white to play here is to reinforce the centre with knight c3. The point behind white's strategy is basically to control and consolidate the centre. And now the most usual move for black is to play d6, and here we have a typical modern structure. But considering this has been seen for the last 100 years and thousands of people have played it, I'm not going to show you that today. I'm going to show you something totally different which you may never have seen before, which is to play instead 3c6. At first sight this move looks ridiculous, like just ask the knight on b8 what it thinks of the move. It can no longer come to c6. It also seems to do nothing for black's development, and after all that is the main purpose of the opening. So it looks at first sight that I'm trying to sell you a dummy. A move like c6 looks totally anti-positional. Now, there's basically 3 main moves which white can play, and these will form 3 independent sections in this video. The 3 main moves are as follows. 1 f4, an attempt by white to grab even more of the centre. Alternatively, white can try bishop c4, more subtle but a very tricky move. And thirdly, knight f3, a move which I consider to be rather boring but nevertheless very popular. And finally we'll just consider some other ideas for white. Bishop e3, or g3, or even something quite wild like h4. But before we look at any precise variations, let's just talk generally about the move 3c6. As I said earlier, one benefit is it takes white away from the main theoretical variations. Now this is obviously going to discomfort the opponent who's been just all geared up to play lots of theoretical moves. And what's more, if you've ever, for instance, faced the Austrian attack in the mainline piers, you can understand why I'm so anxious to avoid these main theoretical lines. By playing 3-6 we really throw white and force them to think on their own terms. But it isn't enough just to play something unusual. For instance, we could also play 3a5, or even better, we could try h5. It isn't enough to be unusual, as I said. It also has to have some independent merit, and the move 3c6 certainly does. The move doesn't stand in its own right. The idea is obviously to challenge the centre, and we challenge the centre with the pawn thrust d5. This is the crux of the opening. Black allows white to take the centre and then prepares to sort of make a direct challenge. Alternatively, c6 also prepares b5. Now this is much less common than d5, but it's certainly an option to be borne in mind. Black prepares a kind of flank attack on the pawn centre. b5 threatens the idea of b4, perhaps to dislodge this knight on c3, and suddenly e4 becomes rather weak. The first move that we're going to consider for white is 4 pawn to f4. Now, white's aim is obvious, to grab as much as the centre as possible. The more centre you can control, the more you can influence the game, and really it looks like black's sort of been left behind a bit. After all, the aim of the opening is to control the centre, and black's moves have been rather peripheral. Look at this bishop on g7, the pawn on c6. They don't seem to be influencing much in the centre of the board. So black's next move is very important and the crux of the whole system. 4 d5, a direct challenge to the centre which white cannot ignore. Now white may look a bit stumped here, and with a bit of luck, white will already go wrong. One way to go wrong is if white exchanges on d5, because as black you can happily recapture. And now let's just have a look at the pawn structure. The d4 and d5 pawns are blocked, but the d4 pawn is a target for black to hit. The knight will come to c6, and if a knight comes to f3 to defend the d4 pawn at some point, we can dislodge further with bishop g4. So as black, you should be very happy indeed to play this position. The f4 pawn is a real plug in white's camp. It blocks in this bishop on c1, and really it makes the whole pawn structure look very unpleasant. White has lost the momentum in the centre, few prospects to expand, and black, I think, is already clearly better. Another way that white could go wrong would be just to develop this knight state, because what we do is we capture on e4, white must recapture, and again we've really upset the harmony in white's pawn position. This d4 pawn is a target, but more importantly this f pawn is absolutely horrific. It blocks in the c1 bishop, and the f4 pawn cannot advance to the logical square f5. So we'd be very happy with this position as black. If white has any sense though, he will just advance the pawn e4, e5. After all, this fits in with white's strategy of grabbing as much as the centre as possible. Now, black needs to take stock of this situation. And before we proceed, let's just make a few general observations about this position. The first thing to notice is that the position has become blocked, in particular the centre. It's actually very rare that after only 5 moves you have a totally blocked position. So in effect, your opponent's going to be not only playing a system he's not seen before, but a type of position that he's not seen before. It's actually very rare to have this sort of complete blockade in so short a number of moves. Now what is less important here is variations. It's much more important to consider the overall strategy, because both players have time. It's a block position and you have time to slowly carry out your strategic aim. Our next move really puts the label on the whole position. h5. h5 is a kind of move which might knock your opponent off his chair in surprise. It's certainly not a move you would play in an open position. You'd find that your king would quickly be wiped away. But because the position is so closed, play becomes much more slow and strategic. And the move h5 fits in very nicely with our plan. First, let's look at the pawn structure. White's pawns have become fixed on the squares d4, e5 and f4. Because of this, we have good control over these important squares e6, f5, g4. And this fits in with our bishop's range along that diagonal. Bishop e6, bishop f5, bishop g4. Total domination of that white diagonal. The pawn then on h5 helps us consolidate control of this g4 square. White's plan might be to sort of charge with g4. So that's another bonus behind the move h5. We're actually preventing white from expanding further on the king side, because if white could play g4 and f5, we might quickly find ourselves squashed. Another feature of this position is that white has now got what we would call a bad bishop. The bishop on c1 doesn't seem to have many prospects. It goes to, say, e3, and it's blocked in very nicely by the d4 pawn and the f4 pawn. So one bonus for us is that we've given white this sort of ugly bishop. We've already spoken about our bishop on c8. Now let's look at our bishop on g7. I have no real problem with our dark squared bishop. I think it's going to become a very strong piece. But on g7 it doesn't seem to have many prospects. White has managed to erect a kind of fortress on d4 and e5. So if we're going to get the g7 bishop into play, we have to think about rerouting. Perhaps it will come to f8 and when we've played e6 at some point, the bishop will now have some play along this diagonal. Alternatively, the bishop may find itself placed on h6 to pressurise the f4 pawn. But what is clear is that we've got to consider the possibility of redeploying this bishop. A further point to note is the scope for the g8 knight. An interesting square that it can hop to is h6. The reason it's so nice on here is because it reinforces these critical squares f5 and g4. This kind of play is all about control. If you can control squares in block positions, you're doing very well. Let's start to look then at some variations. The obvious move we'll consider for white is just to develop this knight to f3, a good, sensible, developing move, reinforcing the centre. We can't have any argument with that. And what we'll consider is knight h6 for black. A move that's obviously going to come in useful because it controls these important squares f5 and g4. White continues with sensible development, bishop to e3, and now black has a dilemma. Black has two interesting tries here. The first that we're going to look at is queen b6. After that we'll consider the move bishop g4. Because this is a standard position in this opening, it's very useful if you're prepared to play both of them, and that way you can surprise your opponent. Queen b6. This sort of throws a spanner in white's development. We're immediately hitting the b2 pawn, and it's not exactly clear how white should defend that. A move like queen c1 leaves really the queen slightly offside, and now we can just continue with our development bishop g4. An alternative is for white to play knight a4, hitting our queen. Now we just drop back, having provoked the knight to a rather silly square. Say a move like bishop f2 for white, because obviously the bishop on e3 is doing very little. Much more useful to think about redeploying the bishop to say h4. Black now can play a move like bishop f5, h3 to prevent this knight from hopping into g4. But now black just simply develops another knight to d7. White plays another sensible move, queen d2, reinforcing the f4 pawn, preparing white for the possibility of queenside castling. But now black can start getting aggressive with this move that we considered earlier, b5. The knight drops back to c3, and suddenly we spring another pawn forward, a5. And if we look at this position, we see that it's very double-edged. Black's pieces are all developed. He's got a pawn charge on the queen side, and really I think it's a lot of fun for black. We can't talk about precise variations because there's so much room for different things to happen, but nevertheless I think you'd all agree that black has a nice, promising position. So the move queen b6 can be very awkward for white to contend with. In the game Herrera Garcia Gonzalez from the Cuban Championship 1989, white tried the rather awkward rook b1 as a means of defending this b2 pawn. The way black continued is very instructive and gives you a very good insight into how to play these positions. The bishop came to g4, the standard move. Bishop e2 to help relieve the pin. e6. It's a very good point to remember that you don't want to play the move e6 until after you've developed the c8 bishop. You want this c8 bishop outside that pawn chain. If necessary, you'll swap it with the knight on f3 or the bishop on e2. But one thing you do not want is to have the bishop stuck on c8 behind the pawn on e6. b4. And now we hop the black knight into this lovely square f5, where it hassles this bishop on e3, which is forced to drop back to f2. And now a very nice move, dropping the bishop back to f8, redeploying the bishop along a much more relevant diagonal, the f8 a3 diagonal. It served its course basically on g7, so we're going to bring it now to f8 and then to e7 at a later date. White castles. And black develops the final piece, knight to d7. White hits the queen, knight a4, and the queen drops back. White tries to consolidate the pawn structure with c3, and now we bring the bishop to its most natural square, e7, where it has influence on both the f8 a3 diagonal and the h4 d8 diagonal. The knight attempts to redeploy, knight b2, and now black shows that this system is very versatile. You can play on both the king side and the queen side. Everyone's looking towards the king side for a possible thrust with h4, say, but no, black suddenly changes course and plays a5, posing a direct question to white's queenside pawn structure. a3, and now another typical move that black has at his disposal. King f8. Rather than castling, you want to castle artificially. King moves to f8, and later it may move to g7. The reason why this is better than just castling, say, is because now we no longer have the option of playing along the h-file and going for a kingside attack. Remember, the whole key to this system is versatility. We have the option of playing on both flanks. What black is doing is essentially playing the square game, and it's worth mentioning here what would happen had white challenged that bishop on g4. h3, black simply captures on f3, white recaptures, and now another move in the square game, h5 to h4. Look at this knight on f5, it's a real monster. Look at this pawn on h4, it prevents white from advancing this pawn, because were white to thrust forward with g2, g4, we'd simply capture en passant, and the pressure along the h-file would be enormous. Perhaps the only option for white to remove this knight is to play bishop g4, and afterwards capture on f5. This doesn't bother us. What we do is capture with the g-pawn, believe it or not. This seems that it weakens our king at first sight and leaves this h4 pawn a bit vulnerable. But this h4 pawn is very well protected by our bishop on e7 and the rook on h8, so we don't even worry too much about this pawn on h4. What is important is that we now have this lovely g-file to range our rooks and possibly a queen along, so that we can hit this very vulnerable g2 pawn and start eyeing the white king. And our king on f8 is as safe as houses. It's very difficult for white to get it. Look at the way we're playing on both sides of the board. We can play on the g-file, and we can also play on the a-file if we capture this pawn on b4. Very versatile stuff. But in the game we're following, Herrera played instead knight g5. But this wasn't a problem for black, because after this exchange on e2, black had got rid of white's squared bishop, which was his good bishop. Our good bishop is the dark squared, and white's bad bishop is the bishop on f2. And if you play through this game, you'll see that black really makes use of these white squares. Black really exploits them. And what's more, black exploits his versatility in the position. He attacks along the a-file and he attacks along the h-file. And white never seems to be able to cope with both threats. This game is classic. It shows you exactly how to play these closed positions. Instead of playing queen b6, black can try the alternative bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3. White may now try and relieve the pin with bishop e2, but we continue with our usual plan of bringing the knight to this powerful outpost on f5. Now white may want to drop the bishop back to f2, but we could try bishop h6 in this position, putting pressure on the pawn on f4, and I think this is quite comfortable for black. So let's consider if white tries to reinforce the bishop on e3 and also the pawn on f4 with queen d2. Now we don't want to take off white's bad bishop on e3, we're much happier to leave our knight on f5. So we carry on with e6. Now white drops the knight back to d1, the aim is to be able to play c2 to c3 and also to reinforce the bishop on e3, and also to perhaps bring this knight round to f2 at a later date. We continue with our development, knight to d7, white castles, and now we step up the pressure on f4 with bishop h6, and you see this pawn is starting to look vulnerable and the bishop on e3 is also slightly weak. White, I think, is already under pressure in this position, but his next move is a blunder, knight f2, and now we see that black has lots of tactical ideas in these positions. We capture the knight on f3, white recaptures, and now we play the powerful knight takes e5. Note that white cannot recapture f takes e5 in view of bishop takes e3. Instead, white has to recapture d takes e5, but now black plays d4, winning back the bishop because, as you can see, it's trapped on e3. Bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4. As you can see, black is winning a pawn because white cannot defend both c2 and f4 at the same time. This is my game against Morris from the British Championships 1990, and I'm already winning in this position. After bishop g4, instead of playing bishop e2, white's best move is probably to grasp the nettle with h3. Hit the bishop. Now bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, knight comes to f5, the bishop drops back to f2, and now we play this useful move h4 to prevent white from advancing that g pawn to g4 and pushing us back. And after white brings the bishop out to d3 to hit our knight on f5, we simply reinforce with e6. This is a typical closed position that arises from this opening with chances for both sides. As you can see, white has a bishop pair and slightly more space, but in compensation, black has this useful knight on f5. If the bishop captures on f5, black can recapture on f5, and now the bishop will drop back to f8, and as we saw earlier, a black rook will come to the g file and harass this g2 pawn. I'm now going to show you a very useful trick which involves adopting a slightly different move order. This is a new idea which I've been developing over the last couple of years, and it's a real blockbuster. Let me show you. White plays e4, and we now play g6. Normal so far. White plays d4, but we do not play bishop g7. Instead, we play d6. White plays knight c3. We still don't play bishop g7. We play c6. At which point, white players usually scratch their heads and look as if they think we're just doing irrelevant kind of moves. They see an opportunity to grab the whole of the centre with f4. But now, the trick. We play d5. Again, the same old story. White has to preserve the integrity of the pawns, So e4, e5 is the move. At which point, people who know think they've got the usual system, an extra tempo for white, that is. For example, if black now plays bishop g7, we have the system that we looked at in the last section, where black's lost a move. When I first played this system, one Bangladeshi international master said, "It's incredible. Norwood plays that strange system, a move behind. But in fact, we've gained a move. If you remember, the bishop was much better off on f8 in all the variations. So, far from playing bishop g7, we're going to leave the bishop on f8 with a smile on our face. It makes absolutely no difference because it's a closed position. We can afford to leave our bishop on its starting square." So let's just recap on how we gained this tempo. Okay, it took us 2 moves to play d5, whereas before it only took us 1. But in effect, we've saved 2 moves by leaving the bishop on f8. So, we've saved 2, lost 1, we've gained 1. This position I've had several times, and I think the best move for black is now to play bishop to g4. White players have tried several ideas against me, and I've not had any problems against any of them. Bishop e2 was tried by Murray Chandler, and if you look at the game, it was really wild and wonderful, but I think from the opening black was already better. An alternative is to play bishop e3. Now black continues with e6 if he wants a quiet positional game, or he can go for the much wilder queen b6, putting pressure on this b2 pawn, and it's actually very difficult for white to defend this pawn. A good plan, which black players should bear in mind, is the idea of playing for e6, knight d7, and a very quick challenge to the centre with c5. All these positions seem to offer great promise for black, and my record with them, to say very modestly, has been extremely good. So I'm recommending to you now what I think is a fantastic, exciting system which your opponent will almost certainly not have seen before. Players of the white pieces may well want to avoid the muddy waters after 4f4. Probably a more reliable move, and also very tricky, is just to play bishop c4. Black could still play d5, but I really don't recommend it. I prefer now to play the more reliable move, d6. Now white has a choice. To go all in, as they say, with queen f3, or to try the more positional knight to f3. So let's look at queen f3. At first sight, the move looks absolutely bizarre, defying the beginner's principle that you shouldn't bring your queen out too early. In fact, when this move was first suggested in analysis, the person taking the black side said, "If this works, then I'm a monkey's bum." Afterwards, the system's received the colourful name of the monkey's bum. It's not as stupid as it looks. If black plays a natural knight f6 to defend against a f7 mate, white thrusts his pawn forward, e5, and black is rather embarrassed since the knight cannot move because of queen takes f7. So black is forced to play another pawn move, e6. Quite amusing, these 3 pawns, all in the centre. White now has several ways of continuing. He can try the aggressive bishop f4, provoking black to grab a pawn, bishop takes d4. This is not a good idea. White will castle queenside, and the pressure along the d-file is going to be unbearable. Instead, black can play a tricky little move, knight d7. Now, if white grabs the pawn, he's quickly punished, knight b6, calmly attacking 2 bishops, and we're going to win one of them. White continues knight g e2. You may be tempted to thrust this d-pawn, d5. I don't think this is a very good idea, because white can simply drop back. And after we capture on e4, white will recapture, and white's got a comfortable space advantage. Rather than d5, the break we're heading for is e5. We can't try it at the moment because bishop takes e5, a tactical blow in view of queen takes f7 mate. So we have to prepare e5, and we do this by playing the useful move queen e7. This defends the d6 pawn and also prepares e5. White drops the bishop back to b3. In certain positions we can embarrass white with a quick pawn thrust b5. It's always useful to bear in mind this advance b5. It can come in very handy. e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, bishop e3, and now at long last we bring out this knight, knight g f6, and black has a very comfortable position. The idea is simply to castle and play knight c5. The queen is starting to look very misplaced on f3, and certainly black has absolutely no problems in this position. So we just looked at 6 bishop f4. Personally, I don't see this as a big problem for black, because really it helps us with our e5 advance. Once we get the e5 move in, we do it with tempo because the bishop has to move. And white certainly can't prevent us from playing e5. Probably more dangerous is white's simple development knight g e2. Knight d7, castles, knight g f6. The bishop drops back to b3, black castles, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, and now e5. White tries to keep the tension in the centre with rook a d1, but we calmly play queen e7. This position arose in the game None Elvis from Skellefteå 1989. Although white did go on to win this game, I think black is already quite comfortable. White continued queen e3, and although none went on to win this game, I'm not sure that black has such a bad position. One possible plan would have been to play g5, bishop g3, and then knight h5, and we can perhaps land a knight on this useful f4 square. We also have the option of playing on the queen side with moves like b5 and a5. What's more, our centre is also quite solid. If white captures on e5, we just capture back with a pawn, and this knight can come to c5 at some point. Notice that the c6 pawn does a very good job of keeping this knight out of this useful d5 square. All in all, I'd be quite happy with black's chances in this position. Instead of queen f3 going all out, white can adopt the quiet approach, knight f3. This seems a modest way of playing, but it's probably white's best chance to gain a minuscule edge. We continue with the obvious developing move, knight f6. And now white can try advancing the e-pawn, e5. We really have to capture, d takes e5. And now knight takes e5. Black castles, white castles, and now we want to challenge that knight on e5, so we play knight bd7. Now if white plays bishop f4 to bolster this knight on e5, black has a way to liquidate to fairly easy equality. Knight to h5. If the bishop moves away, then we capture the knight on e5 and win a pawn. So white must exchange on d7. Bishop to e5. We're happy to swap off.
And now simply queen f5, and after rook e1, just bishop e6. And here we have complete equality. If white exchanges the bishop on e6, we can recapture with the queen, and this e5 pawn can even become a weakness. It's very easy for us to contest the d file, we've got absolutely no problems. Or with bishop d3, queen g5, and we could soon be getting an attack on the white king here. This system seems totally safe for black. More promising for white than the e5 push is just to play the bishop calmly back to b3. Black castles, white castles, and now we could try bishop g4. It gets hit immediately, so we exchange the knight on f3, the queen recaptures, and now we could play a move like e6. White continues developing, bishop g5, we hit, the bishop drops back, and now we complete the development of our last piece. After knight bd7, black is very well placed to meet any of white's aggressive tries. For instance, e5 is well covered, d5 is well covered. Black has the option of contending the centre with e5. Black can also think about expanding on the queen side with b5 and a5. Bishop c4 then can be an irritating move, but it shouldn't really worry us. But there are certain things that we have to look out for. Always beware of a possible e4, e5 break by white, especially when our knight is on f6. This can sometimes be very embarrassing if the knight doesn't have a good retreat square. Another thing to be aware of is not to play b5 too early, because very often, once the bishop has dropped back, this pawn can become a target. It also prevents us from immediately trying for, say, a c5 break. It's much better to keep the potential of this queenside advance than to actually spend it straight away. Also, remember e5 is the move that we're looking for. This is usually the crux. It's a much better break than d5. If we're playing for d5, white can usually maintain a nice positional edge. e5 is the way to contest the centre. If white prefers a quiet life, then he'll probably shun both f4 and bishop c4 in favour of knight f3. Now, one possibility is to continue d6 in typical modern lines and play for e5. Notice in the last section I did recommend playing for e5 if white hasn't played f4. But in this position we are able to play immediately d5 because white doesn't have this bishop on c4 preventing us. Notice in the last section, in order to play d5, we usually had to have the pawn on e6. And that pawn on e6 blocked in our bishop on c8. So d5 was a much less effective idea because after the bishop dropped back to d3, only if we had an exchange on e4 say, this poor bishop has to stay at home in view of this pawn. So we obviously have a big difference. Here we can play d5 in one move and we've got no problems with this fellow on c8. d5 puts the immediate question to white. Should white capture on d5 say? E takes d5, c takes d5. Well, I can't believe that black has any problems in this position. The knight's going to come to c6, the bishop's going to come to g4. We're going to have very good pressure on this d4 pawn. I can't believe black's doing badly at all. Should white advance? e4, e5. Well, white does get more space, but I think we can now challenge that pawn. f6. If e takes f6, knight takes f6, and black can later castle, and maybe get pressure on the semi-open f-file. But as I stated earlier, people who are playing knight f3 are going to be wanting a quiet life, and by far the most popular move in this position is simply to play h3. Now this move looks very peaceful indeed, but it does prevent black from playing bishop g4. The idea is to dislodge the d4 pawn by hitting the knight on f3. h3 prevents all that, and also slightly embarrasses this bishop on c8. It's now got no natural development square. At this point, we now have a divergence. Black has three options. The first is to play d takes e4. The alternative is to deploy the knight to h6. And the final option is to bring more pressure onto the centre with knight f6. D takes e4. A very reliable move, but the reason I'm not so keen on it is it takes some of the tension out of the position. It takes away the dynamism. White will recapture, knight takes e4. And now knight d7. Obviously we're preparing to challenge that knight on e4 with knight to f6. White continues, development, and now we bring the knight out to f6. We see an exchange. Castles, castles, rook e1, and the only real square for the bishop, f5. White keeps developing, and now we bring the bishop to this important square. As you can see, we now have the option of dropping the bishop back to d5. Essentially this black bishop is our problem, the white squared bishop. c3, bishop d5, bishop b3, rook e8, bishop e5, and here we have a fairly level position. White has slightly more space, but black's position is ultra solid. But if we really want to liven the game up, we'll avoid playing d takes e4. We could try knight h6. This is a rather odd looking move, and white can try and blow black away immediately. For example, e takes d5, c takes d5, and now g4. As black will castle calmly, bishop e3, f6, queen d2 hitting our knight on h6, which retreats to f7, white castles, we bring our knight to c6, white plays king b1, and now queen a5 was tried in the game Anand Gapindrashvili, and in my opinion black seems to be doing fine. There's lots of prospects for queenside storm with a6 b5, and black's kingside position looks very solid. The knight could deploy to d6 and maybe c4 or even e4. So certainly there's a lot of potential in black's position, and I really wouldn't mind playing black here. More reliable for white is just to play bishop f4. Now it looks like black is going to capture on e4, and when white recaptures, play knight f5 hitting the d4 pawn. But this isn't so effective because white can easily secure the d4 pawn by just playing c3, and the knight starts to look less useful on f5. A much funkier idea is as follows. f6. At first sight this looks ridiculous. Our bishop on g7 is blocked and the move seems to wreck our pawn structure. But it's not so simple. The knight on h6 now has a square to come back to, f7, and after black castles we can create a kind of fortress. White usually captures e takes d5, and after c takes d5 there's several ways to continue. Bishop takes b8 has been tried, and now after rook takes b8, bishop b5 check, and now king f8 is the move. The reason why we move our king is because we don't want to give up our white square bishop with bishop d7. Much of our play revolves around controlling important squares like e6, and we need this bishop to do this job. This position is quite double-edged, and likely continuation would be as follows. Queen e2, the knight drops back to f7, white will castle, and black can play e6. The bishop drops back to d3, it's doing nothing on b5, but now bishop h6 and we start to see the point. The king is finding himself a home on g7, and the bishop could redeploy via f4. The rook could come to e8, and let's just remember that white, although he's got a temporary initiative, actually has one less central pawn, and black has the bishop pair. So my personal opinion would be to favour black, but of course the position that we started from, after bishop h6, must just be considered unclear. An alternative to bishop takes b8 is knight b5 going for the throat on c7. Knight a6, c4, castles, c takes d5, queen takes d5, knight drops back to c3 hitting the queen, which drops back to f7, queen b3, queen takes b3, a takes b3, and black has a perfectly respectable endgame position. So after bishop f4, it's not quite clear how white should proceed. It looks like white's doing incredibly well. But say white just played normal moves like bishop d3, the knight could drop back to f7, white could castle, black could castle, and now say if rook e1, who knows, maybe black can try e5 and start challenging the centre. For example, d takes e5, f takes e5, bishop g3, and now d4. Seems perfectly okay for black. The whole thing is very, very muddy and murky, but who knows, maybe black's position is very, very playable. Certainly no one seems to have refuted it in Grandmaster chess so far. So the third idea for black in this position is to play knight f6, bringing pressure to that e4 pawn. White has a usual dilemma, to reinforce with bishop d3 or to push with e5. So let's consider white pushing e4, e5. The knight now hops into this square e4. Again, white has a dilemma, to play bishop d3 or to capture on e4. Knight takes e4, d takes e4, knight g5. It looks here like black is losing a pawn, but we have some tactics to save us. c5, hitting the pawn chain. Knight takes e4, c takes d4, f4, and now queen b6. Bishop d3, and now a nice move, knight a6 rather than knight c6. The idea is the knight can come to b4 or c5, and black is pretty much equalised in this position. Since knight takes e4 doesn't seem to give white any advantage, we'll consider the alternative, bishop to d3. We now play knight takes c3, and white recaptures. Both sides put their kings away, and now the move b6 with the plan of c5 has been tried by black. Personally, I think this is a bit too weakening. My own preference is for immediately knight d7. If you look at this position, black looks totally solid, and there's two perfectly reasonable plans available. One is the break f6, hitting white's pawn chain. Another is the break c5, which could perhaps be followed up by b6. Personally, I don't see why black has any problem in this position, and I'd certainly be happy. e5 then doesn't seem to be much of a problem, and the alternative is bishop d3. Black now has a cunning way to liquidate. D takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and now bishop f5. White will quickly grab this piece, thinking that he's doubled our pawns, but now we come out with the point, queen a5 check, and after c3 we capture the bishop on f5, keeping our pawns intact, and having exchanged off white's good bishop, we can now quite safely claim to have equalised. We'll now consider some other fourth move alternatives for white. Let's try a pretty wild one. White throws the h-pawn down the board, h4. Well, if you remember your classical theory in chess, if someone comes down the wing, you hit in the centre. So I think d5 in this position is very appropriate. We're threatening to play d takes e4, after which the d-pawn will be en prise. If white advances e4, e5, then we can try our whole old friend h5, and suddenly this pawn on h4 no longer looks so impressive. White could also try to fianchetto. Now this is a very popular system against the modern Piets, and many white players will probably just reel it out anyway. But it can be well met by our universal penicillin d5, and after bishop to g2 we just take on e4. Knight takes e4, and now queen takes d4, winning a pawn. So white has to defend the e-pawn. E takes d5 would give absolutely no initiative after simply c takes d5. Again, the d4 pawn looks quite vulnerable. So white must push. e4, e5. Now we can challenge the e5 pawn with f6. And after f4, knight h6. And this position, similar to the positions we were looking at in the first section, can be a lot of fun for black. Other moves like f3 are well met simply by d5. Generally speaking, challenging the centre with d5, you can't go far wrong. White's most powerful alternative to the main lines is to play the sensible bishop e3. Now black players have generally been tempted just to plough on with d5. But white can try here queen d2. D takes e4, knight takes e4, knight d7, castles, knight gf6, an exchange on f6, the knight recaptures, knight f3, castles, and now the young Judith Polgar in a game against Dunnington played knight e5, and I feel somehow that white has an initiative in this position. I'm not totally happy with black's position. So let's try an alternative. Personally, I'm not too happy with positions after d5. So if you want to avoid the mainline modern Piet's positions after d6, you might like to think about a brand new idea. b5. At first sight looks a bit crazy, but it does have its good points. Say white thrusts forward with f4. We could now kick the knight on c3 with b4, and after knight e2 we play knight f6, hitting the e4 pawn. Now if white was to push e4, e5, we've got knight d5, and the knight is on a very happy square on d5. What if white tries f3? Well, now we do have to move into slightly unusual Piet's modern variations, d6. Queen d2, and now we bring this knight out to d7. Notice we keep this g8 knight back, which prevents white from coming down to h6, exchanging off bishops. So this g8 knight stays at home for a while. White charges on the queen side with h4, and we meet this with h5. Now, white players often castle, queen side of course, and now the point is knight b6. And look how well this knight on b6 works with these b5 and c6 pawns. The knight eyes the c4 square. It doesn't want to occupy it immediately, but it's certainly got it in sight. So now, for instance, if white was to play knight g2, our knight would jump into c4 and the queen and bishop would be very embarrassed. So the knight is forced to deploy over to h3. But now we could try a move like rook b8. For example, bishop d3, and now it's probably time to throw our knight in. Knight c4, bishop takes c4, pawn takes c4. Okay, we've got double c-pawns, but look what we've got on the b-file. The queen's coming to b6, and white's going to be under real pressure defending that b2 pawn. In my opinion, these positions, although unclear, seem to offer fantastic attacking opportunities for black.
What we have then is a system that's highly original, and the chances are your opponent may never have even seen it before. But the big question is originality enough? There's plenty of ways to be original in chess. In my opinion, the opening is totally sound. I've now been trying it out for nearly 10 years, and I've managed to outfox some of the world's leading grandmasters. The beauty is you get them in these positions that they just haven't seen before, and they don't know how to continue. And as I said, this works against the world's best, so that should vouch for the soundness. I really would recommend this opening. The key is to sort of master the ideas, and once you become au fait with the strategy, I think you can confidently play against anyone. So all I'd say to you now is go and try it out, and good luck.